The first time Wren Calloway lied to her family, she was 9 years old and she said she hadn't broken the porch swing. She had. The chain had snapped under her weight and she'd caught herself against the railing with a bruise the size of a plum blooming on her hip. And when her father asked who'd done it, she said she didn't know. It wasn't the lie that mattered. It was the relief on her father's face when he decided to believe her. Because Wren was quiet, because Wren was careful, because Wren had never once in her short life given him a reason to look at her twice. That relief taught her something she would carry for the next 25 years. In the Calloway house, the safest place to stand was in the dark, just outside the light everyone else was fighting over. By the time she was 34, she'd made a whole life out of standing in the dark, and she'd done it so well that her own mother didn't know what she did for a living. Marsh Bend, Ohio, was the kind of town where everyone's business ran on a shared circuit, and the Calloway name sat close to the breaker box. Her father, Dale Calloway, had been county sheriff for 19 years, the sort of lawman who showed up at Friday night football games in his good boots and shook every hand in the stands like he was running for something, which as it turned out he finally was. Her mother, Carol, had spent those same 19 years building the Calloways into the closest thing Marsh Bend had to royalty. Church socials, ribbon cuttings, a Christmas card so aggressively cheerful it should have come with a warning label. Wren's older brother, Beau, had inherited their father's handshake and their mother's instinct for a camera, and at 38 he'd quit his job at the county auditor's office to run Dale's campaign for state senate, a role everyone agreed suited him, the way a suit suits a mannequin, which Wren had once said out loud at Thanksgiving and instantly regretted, because nobody laughed except her grandmother, who was, by then, mostly there for the pie. And then there was Tansy. Tansy was 36, blonde in the specific honeyed way that photographed well under fluorescent lights, and she anchored the 5 o'clock news at the regional affiliate 40 minutes north in Danfield. Tansy had been homecoming queen. Tansy had been salutatorian. Tansy had married a orthodontist named Grant who wore boat shoes without irony and who called Dale sir, even in casual conversation. Tansy was, in the specific vocabulary of the Calloway household, a credit to the family, and had been since roughly the moment she was born, 2 years and 4 months before Wren. Wren was the middle child in a family of 3, which meant mathematically she should have been the fulcrum. Instead she was the footnote. She had failed, or so the family believed, her first year of law school at Ohio State, dropped out under circumstances nobody in Marsh Bend fully understood because Wren had never bothered to explain them, and moved to Columbus, where she was assumed, in the vague and slightly embarrassed way families assume things about their disappointments, to be waiting tables or temping or finding herself, a phrase her mother used the way other people used a diagnosis. What Wren actually did was walk into a federal courthouse 4 days a week and put people who thought they were untouchable into rooms where touchability was, in fact, the entire point. She had not failed out of law school. She had left Ohio State after her first year, not because she couldn't hack it, but because in the spring of that year, working a clinical internship with the county prosecutor's office back home, she'd found a filing cabinet drawer that didn't add up, evidence logs with dates that didn't match custody chains, a drug case that had been quietly downgraded after a campaign donor's son got picked up with enough product to be charged as intent to distribute. She'd asked a question. She'd been told gently by a man who'd known her since she was in diapers, that she should let it go, that this was how a small county worked, that her father, who ran the department that had processed that evidence, wouldn't want her digging where she had no business digging. She'd gone home that night and looked at her father across the dinner table and understood, with the sick clarity of someone whose whole childhood suddenly rearranges itself around one new fact, that he had known. Maybe not the specifics. But he had known enough and he had chosen not to know more because knowing more would have cost him something, and Dale Calloway did not pay costs he could avoid. She didn't confront him. She didn't confront anyone. That was never how she operated, not even then. She transferred her credits to a program at Georgetown that let her finish her degree while she also quietly began talking to people. First a professor with DOJ contacts, then an actual person at the Department of Justice's Public Integrity section who was, it turned out, extremely interested in small counties where evidence had a way of evaporating around the right names. She told her family none of it. She told them she'd dropped out. She let them believe it the way she'd once let her father believe the porch swing had broken itself, because the alternative, being seen, being watched, being weighed by people who had already decided her weight, had never once in her life gone well for her. For the next 11 years, while her family filed her away as the disappointing one, Ren Calloway became in order. A JAG officer who spent 2 years prosecuting fraud cases on an army base in Georgia. A line attorney in the Southern District of Ohio. And finally, 4 years ago, an assistant United States attorney assigned to the Public Corruption Unit. The unit that, as it happened, had spent the last 2 years building a case file with the word Calloway typed at the top of it in a font nobody in her family would have recognized as belonging to their own daughter. She had recused herself from that file the day her supervisor showed it to her. She had also, quietly, made sure she was the one who got read in on every development, because recusal did not mean blindness, and Ren had learned a long time ago that the only way to protect people you loved from a fire was to know exactly how hot it was going to get. She told no one in Marsh Bend any of this. Not because she was ashamed. Because she had learned the hard way at 9 years old on a broken porch swing, that in her family information was a weapon, and the people who loved you best were not always the people you could safely hand a weapon to. The night everything came apart was the night of Tansy's campaign kickoff. Not Tansy's campaign exactly, though everyone in Marsh Bend had long ago stopped distinguishing between the two. It was billed as Dale Calloway's official launch for State Senate, District 14. But Carol had built the whole evening around Tansy, who would be emceeing, because Tansy on camera made donors reach for their checkbooks the way nothing else in the family did. The Marsh Bend Grange Hall had been rented and decorated with more bunting than the building had probably seen since the bicentennial. There was a local news crew, not Tansy's station, a competitor which had caused its own quiet argument, and 120 folding chairs and a banner that read Calloway for Ohio in navy and gold, and a photograph of Dale in his sheriff's uniform blown up 8 feet tall behind the podium, because nothing said statesman like a man who'd spent 2 decades pulling people over on Route 9. Ren went because not going would have required an explanation she didn't want to give, and because some small, stubborn part of her still wanted to see her family from the back row, unnoticed, the way she'd been seeing them her whole life. She wore a gray blazer that made her look, she knew, like exactly the kind of unremarkable woman nobody photographed at these things. And she stood near the coat rack and watched her father shake 400 hands and watched her mother work the room like a woman conducting an orchestra. And she watched Beau, flushed and expansive with 2 glasses of the cheap Prosecco the campaign had sprung for, laughing too loud at his own jokes near the drinks table. She left before the speeches ended. He always did. There was a version of Ren who might have stayed to hear her father talk about family values and law and order to a room full of people who thought they knew the family in question. But that version of Ren had died somewhere around the filing cabinet drawer in the county prosecutor's office, 11 years ago, and the one who remained preferred fresh air. She was 3 miles down Route 9 headed back toward the extended stay motel outside Danfield where she'd been staying for the 6 weeks of this assignment, because her cover story, the one her family believed, was that she was in the area for a temp gig doing paralegal work, which was, if you squinted, not even technically a lie, when she got the call from her mother. It was 11:47 p.m. Ren remembered the time precisely later because time would matter, because time was the thing that eventually took the whole story apart at its seams and put it back together in a shape her family had never intended. Ren. Her mother's voice had a pitch to it Ren had heard exactly twice before in her life. Once when her grandfather died, once when the bank called about the second mortgage on the house nobody was supposed to know about. Ren, I need you to come to the house. No. Don't stop anywhere. Don't talk to anyone. Mom, what's... Now, Ren. She drove the 4 miles back into town with her hands too tight on the wheel, running through possibilities the way she'd been trained to, cataloging and discarding, and none of the possibilities she came up with were as strange as the one waiting for her in the Calloway's kitchen. The house was lit up like it was expecting company for a holiday, every downstairs light blazing, and there were 2 cars in the driveway that didn't belong to family. A black Lexus she didn't recognize and Beau's truck, its front bumper pulled crooked in a way that made something go cold and still in Ren's chest before she'd even parked. Inside, the kitchen island had become a war table. Her mother stood at the head of it in the same navy dress she'd worn to the podium 3 hours earlier, makeup still television ready, eyes red-rimmed underneath it. Her father was on the phone in the next room, his voice low and clipped in the register Ren recognized from 20 years of watching him talk his way around a problem. Beau sat on a stool with a dish towel wrapped around his knuckles and would not look at anyone. And beside her mother, papers spread out on the granite like a hand of cards already played, stood a man in a suit that cost more than Ren's monthly rent, whom her mother introduced without preamble as Mr. Hartley. He handles things for the campaign. What happened? Ren said. Not a question. A demand in the flat voice she used in interview rooms, though nobody in that kitchen would have recognized it as a professional instrument, because none of them had ever heard her use it. Her mother's chin trembled once and then steadied the way it always did, the way Carol Calloway's chin had steadied through funerals and foreclosure threats and one memorable incident involving Dale and a woman from the county clerk's office that the whole family had agreed, without ever discussing it, to never mention again. Beau was leaving the Grange Hall, her mother said. He was upset, the numbers from the last poll, you know how he gets, and there was a man walking on the shoulder of County Road 9, near the Fenwick turnoff. It was dark. There was no reason for anyone to be out there on foot at that hour, none, and Beau, her voice caught, restarted. Beau clipped him. The man went into the ditch. Beau panicked. He drove home. Is the man alive? He's at Marsh Bend General. Broken leg, a concussion, they think he'll be fine, thank God, but Wren. Her mother reached across the island and took both of Wren's hands, and it was that gesture, more than anything said before it, that told Wren exactly what was coming, because her mother had not held her hands like that since she was small enough to need help crossing a street. The police are going to come. Tonight, tomorrow, soon. And your father is 3 months from an election that decides whether this family means anything in this state for the next 20 years. Beau cannot be the one in that headline. Do you understand what a DUI hit and run does to a state Senate campaign 8 weeks before the primary? It doesn't just end Beau's future. It ends your father's. It ends everything we have built. Mom. Wren pulled her hands back, slow, careful, the way you moved around something you didn't yet understand the shape of. What are you asking me? It was Mr. Hartley who answered, sliding a single typed sheet of paper across the granite with the ease of a man who had done this before for other families in other kitchens. Wren looked down at it and felt the floor tilt very slightly under her feet. It was a statement. A confession typed up clean, dated for that night, in which the driver of the vehicle involved in the Route 9 incident identified herself, by name, by signature line, by a blank space waiting for Wren Calloway's handwriting, as having been alone, having had 2 drinks at a family event, having panicked, having left the scene, having decided now, hours later, to come forward and take responsibility like the honest person she'd always tried to be. You weren't at the hall that late, her mother said, already moving, already building the story the way she built every story, brick by fast brick. Nobody will remember exactly when you left. You drove home the back way, we all know you do, past the Fenwick turnoff. It's not even a lie, Wren, it's barely a stretch. You could have been on that road. I wasn't on that road. You could have been. Her mother's eyes were wet and terribly, terribly steady. Sweetheart. Listen to me. You have. And here her mother paused just long enough for Wren to hear the sentence assembling itself, the sentence that had been sitting loaded in the family's chamber for 11 years, waiting for exactly this moment to be fired. You have so much less to lose. You don't have a career that depends on this town. You don't have a marriage, a mortgage, people counting on you. Beau has a campaign to run. Your father has a Senate seat riding on the next 90 days. What do you have, Wren? What is one bad night going to cost you that you can't afford? There was. The whole architecture of her family laid bare on a granite countertop at midnight, dressed up as love and priced out in exact figures. What everyone else stood to lose and what Wren, quiet Wren, failed Wren, Wren who did paralegal work somewhere and came home for Christmas and never made a scene, did not. 11 years earlier, in a filing cabinet in the county prosecutor's office, she had learned that her father's department made evidence disappear when the right people needed it to. Tonight, in her mother's kitchen, she was learning that the same operating principle extended all the way down to blood. Some things in this family were negotiable. She had simply never before understood that she was one of them. She looked at Beau, who still hadn't lifted his eyes from the dish towel wrapped around his knuckles. Not injured knuckles, she noted, in the part of her brain that never fully stopped noting things. Just white-knuckled from gripping something, maybe the wheel, maybe the countertop, maybe 11 years of being the son who was allowed to be careless because someone else would always absorb the cost of it. Say something, her mother said. Wren looked at the confession on the counter. She thought about how easy it would be, how practiced her hand already was at disappearing into a story someone else had written for her, how she'd been doing exactly that since she was 9 years old and the porch swing broke and she chose the dark over the light. She thought about the case file with her family's name on it sitting in a locked cabinet in a federal building 40 minutes away, the one she'd recused herself from and also never stopped watching, the one that had been quietly, patiently documenting for 2 years the ways in which Dale Calloway's department handled inconvenient facts. She thought about the word integrity, which her father used often and expensively in stump speeches, and what it might mean to finally test in this kitchen, whether the word had ever once applied to anyone at that table besides her. And she thought with a calm that surprised even her that she was done auditioning. "No," she said. The word landed in the kitchen like a dropped plate. "Ren." Her mother's voice sharpened, the wet steadiness gone, replaced by something with an edge on it. "This is not a discussion. This is your family. I know exactly what it is." "He could go to prison," her mother said, gesturing at Bo, who finally looked up, and Ren saw in his face, not remorse but calculation, the specific expression of a man doing math on how bad this could get for him personally, and she understood in that instant that whatever guilt he felt about the man in the ditch on Route 9 was already being filed under acceptable losses, alongside everything else that had ever been asked of other people on his behalf. "He might," Ren said. "That's what happens sometimes when you hit a person with your truck and drive away instead of stopping. You don't understand what's at stake." "I understand exactly what's at stake." Ren picked up the confession, and for one long moment her mother's face lit with something like hope, before Ren folded the paper in half and then in half again and set it back down on the counter, no longer readable, no longer a document anyone could hand her to sign. "I'm not going to lie to the police for Bo. I'm not going to lie to anyone ever again for this family. I've spent my whole life being the one who disappears so the rest of you don't have to look bad. I'm done." "You ungrateful," her father's voice from the doorway. He'd come in sometime during the last exchange, phone still in his hand, and his face had the particular red flush it got right before he raised his voice, though he didn't raise it now, just let it go low and hard, which was worse. "This family gave you everything, and the one time we ask you to take a felony for Bo," Ren said. "You're asking me to take a felony hit and run for Bo, and you're calling it what this family gave me." Her father's jaw worked. Mr. Hartley, to his credit, had gone very still, the stillness of a professional who had just realized the room was about to become a liability rather than an asset, and he was already subtly gathering his own papers off the counter, putting a small deniable distance between himself and whatever came next. "There's a man in Marsh Bend General with a broken leg," Ren said, because Bo got behind the wheel of his truck after 2 glasses of Prosecco and decided that road belonged to him more than it belonged to a person walking on the shoulder of it. "And your solution?" The solution this family arrived at in under an hour with a lawyer with a typed confession before the police even called, was to find the person in this house whose life you've always agreed matters least and hand her the bill. "That is not," her mother started. "It is exactly that," Ren said. "It has always been exactly that. You just never had to say it out loud before because I always did what you needed without making you say it." Nobody spoke. Outside, far off, a siren rose and then faded, headed somewhere else, not for them, not yet. "I'm leaving," Ren said. "When the police come, tell them the truth or don't. That's your choice to make. It's not going to be mine to make for you. Not tonight. Not ever again." She walked out through the kitchen and the front hall and the porch, past the exact spot she realized only as she crossed it, where the swing used to hang before her father finally took it down years ago, the chain having never been properly fixed. And she got in her car and drove, hands steady now in a way they hadn't been on the way in, back toward the motel outside Danfield where, before she slept, she made one phone call. It was not to a lawyer. It was to the supervisor who'd read her into the Calloway file 2 years earlier, and all she said at 1:30 in the morning was, "There's been an incident on County Road 9 tonight involving Bo Calloway. I think this is the thing we've been waiting for. I need to talk about how we handle my recusal from here." What happened over the following 10 weeks did not look from the outside like revenge, because Ren had never believed in revenge as a shape a life should take. It looked instead like a slow and extremely well-documented accounting. The Marsh Bend County Sheriff's Department opened an investigation into the Route 9 hit and run the next morning. Ren knew because she'd spent 2 years quietly watching the file, exactly how such investigations tended to go when they touched a Calloway. How evidence acquired a certain flexibility, how witness statements developed convenient gaps, how a rush order paint sample from a suspect vehicle might simply never make it to the state lab. She did not intervene. That was the discipline of it, the part that cost her the most. She did not call anyone, did not leak anything, did not do a single thing that could later be characterized as interference. She had spent 11 years building a case on the principle that the truth, given enough time and the right process, defended itself better than any person could defend it for it. She was not going to abandon that principle now because it was, for once, her own family in the room. What she did do was call the man in the ditch. His name was Curtis Ames. He was 41, worked third shift at the plastics plant outside Danfield, and had been walking the shoulder of County Road 9 that night because his truck was in the shop and his sister, who was supposed to pick him up from a friend's, hadn't answered her phone. He had a broken tibia, a concussion, $4,000 in medical bills his insurance wasn't fully covering, and when Wren visited him at Marsh Bend General 2 days after the accident, not as an aide, not with a badge, just as a woman who introduced herself only as someone who wanted to make sure he had a lawyer who wasn't handed to him by the Callaway campaign, a headlight-shaped bruise on his hip that would, weeks later in a courtroom, be entered into evidence alongside a paint chip. Recovered from the scene and matched, eventually, despite the county lab's mysterious 3-week delay in processing it, to a specific and distinctive shade of navy blue that Ford had used on exactly one model year of F-150. Beau's truck was that model year. Beau's truck also, Wren learned from Curtis's new attorney a month later, had acquired a suspiciously fresh coat of touch-up paint on its front bumper sometime in the 72 hours after the accident, a detail the sheriff's department's own initial incident report had somehow failed to note, despite 2 deputies having examined the vehicle in the Callaway driveway the morning after. That omission was the thread Wren had been waiting 2 years to see someone pull. It was not on its own a federal case. A local hit-and-run, a possibly sloppy incident report, even a family with influence over a small county sheriff's department. None of that alone crossed the threshold that would let the U.S. Attorney's Office get involved. But it did not stand alone. It sat on top of 2 years of documentation, a drug case downgraded for a donor's son 11 years earlier, a pattern since then of evidence irregularities in cases touching politically connected families in Marsh Bend County, sworn statements, gathered quietly over the previous 18 months by 2 other AUSAs who were not related to anyone in the file, from 3 former sheriff's deputies willing to talk about what handling things had actually meant inside that department for the better part of 2 decades. The Route 9 hit-and-run was not the case. It was the loose thread that, once pulled by people who were not Wren, unraveled a much larger one, a public corruption and evidence tampering investigation into the Marsh Bend County Sheriff's Department that had been building patiently for longer than Curtis Ames had been walking on that shoulder. Wren did not pull that thread herself. She had recused formally in writing the moment the accident happened, precisely so that when the thread did get pulled, no one could ever say a Callaway had done the pulling. She spent those 10 weeks doing paralegal work, technically true work, on an unrelated fraud matter in Columbus, staying visibly, deliberately, boringly far away from Marsh Bend, while 2 colleagues she trusted built, brick by careful brick, the same kind of case her mother had once tried to build against her in a kitchen at midnight. Except this one was made of things that were actually true. The story broke first in the Danfield paper, then in the regional press, then inevitably on the same news affiliate where Tansy anchored the 5 o'clock. Though not from Tansy's desk, her employer, with a swiftness that told its own story about how little goodwill remained once the wind shifted, pulled her from the anchor chair the week the indictment came down and quietly did not schedule her back. Dale Callaway Senate campaign collapses amid corruption probe, one headline read. Son charged in hit-and-run as federal investigation widens, read another. Beau was charged with leaving the scene of an accident, and once the paint and the bruise and the conveniently absent lab report were laid out for a grand jury with obstruction for the touch-up paint alone. Dale Callaway suspended his campaign 9 days before the primary filing deadline, in a statement Mr. Hartley almost certainly wrote, which used the word family 4 times and the word responsibility not once. Wren was not named in any of it, not at first. Her recusal held. It was 3 weeks after the indictments, when a Columbus Dispatch reporter doing a deeper piece on the Marsh Bend investigation ran her name against a routine record search and found, sitting quietly in the public docket of an entirely unrelated fraud case from the year before, the signature line of Assistant United States Attorney W. Callaway, that the 2 threads of her life, the invisible daughter and the federal prosecutor, finally touched. The story that ran was not about revenge. Wren made sure of that in the one interview she agreed to give, brief, controlled, more careful than any cross-examination she'd ever conducted, because this time the stakes were her own. She did not say her mother had asked her to falsely confess. She did not say her father had known for 2 decades, more than a sheriff should know and do nothing about. She said only that she had recused herself the moment the case touched her family, that the process had worked the way it was supposed to, and that she had every confidence in the professionals who had actually built the case. It was, in its own way, the truest thing she had ever said publicly about her family, that the system left alone to do its work without her thumb on it in either direction, had told the truth better than any of them ever had at that kitchen island. She saw her mother once more before the trial at a gas station outside Marsh Bend of all places, both of them filling up at adjacent pumps in a coincidence so mundane it felt almost like a mercy. No stage, no kitchen island, no typed confession waiting on granite, just 2 women and 140 miles of highway between where they used to stand and where they stood now. Carol looked older. Not dramatically. Just the specific tiredness of a woman whose whole architecture had been built around a story that had turned out to be load-bearing in ways she hadn't accounted for. She didn't reach for Wren's hands this time. "You could have told us," she said. Not an accusation exactly. Something closer to grief. "All those years. You could have told us who you actually were." Wren thought about that. Really thought about it, the pump handle cold in her hand, the late afternoon light going long in gold across the parking lot the way it did in Marsh Bend in a way it never quite did anywhere else she'd lived. She thought about the porch swing and the filing cabinet drawer and every dinner table where she'd learned, one silence at a time, exactly how much of herself was safe to bring into that house. "I did tell you," she said finally. "The night in the kitchen. That was me telling you exactly who I was. You just didn't like the answer because it wasn't the one you'd already written down for me." Her mother's face did something complicated, pride and grief and something that might, in a different family in a different life, have been the beginning of an apology. "Is he going to prison?" Carol asked. "Bo. That's up to a jury," Wren said. "It was always going to be up to a jury. It just took this long for anyone in our family to let it be someone else's decision instead of ours to bury." She capped her tank and hung up the pump and got back in her car, and did not wait to see whether her mother had anything left to say because she had at last stopped needing to hear it in order to know exactly who she was. Curtis Ames's leg healed enough eventually that he went back to walking that same stretch of Route 9 sometimes in daylight now, a habit his physical therapist called stubborn and his sister called ridiculous, and Curtis himself, when a Danfield reporter asked him about it for a follow-up piece nobody but Wren ever really read all the way to the end, called something closer to proof. That a road that had once nearly killed him, and had certainly buried one family's whole careful mythology in a ditch beside it, could still eventually be walked on safely, if enough people were finally willing to tell the truth about who'd been driving.